Lady Beatrice Hawthorne had been a widow long enough that society no longer spoke of her as though she had merely stepped away from life. In the 3 seasons since her husband's carriage had overturned on the London road, she had learned the precise temperature of a room. She knew when a lady's smile was meant to soothe, and when it was meant to measure. She knew which questions were asked from concern and which were asked for sport. She also knew, with a clarity that only grief could sharpen, what she would not do: not remarry, not be paraded, not allow another man's name to blot out the memory of the life she had chosen and then lost. Her promise had been made in private, at her husband's desk, with her fingers on the worn edge of his writing blotter, and she had renewed it through the seasons like a vow attended by no priest. The marriage mart was a cruel machine, and Beatrice had put her own hands on the gears to make it behave. She had money enough to refuse. She had an entailed estate enough to be refused by fewer people than she ought. That balance, enough independence to be interesting, enough propriety to be untouchable, had made her the subject of every tactful invitation in May and every carefully worded omission in October. At Lady Selina, Trench's insistence delivered as if it were generosity. Beatrice returned to the world, Mrs. Trench had been a widow before. Beatrice had worn her widowhood like a second gown, practical, flattering, and meant to be noticed. She had helped Beatrice navigate the necessary morning calls, and had, in return, expected obedience where Beatrice's spirit was most stubborn. This year, the season required Beatrice to attend Almack's. It required, too, that she be seen accepting dances with men of consequence, even while she kept her own counsel. Mrs. Bree Trench believed in the arithmetic of reputation. If you do not choose, they will choose for you, she often said, as though reputation were a gentleman's debt. Beatrice complied. She smiled when required. She curtsied when expected. She spoke only enough to keep the ton from constructing a life for her. Yet, when the invitations multiplied and the calls grew thick as paste, she felt her widow's oath stiffen again, like a ribbon tied too tightly around the heart. Her restraint, however, had not gone unnoticed. It was, in fact, the quality that made her dangerous. A woman who refused to weep in public was suspected of having a secret. A woman who refused to laugh too readily was assumed to be counting coins. A woman who declined offers with perfect politeness was presumed to be waiting for the right kind of attention. The right kind of attention arrived in the form of Duke Reginald Whitecliffe. Beatrice had first encountered him at a dinner where the candles had burned too brightly, and everyone pretended it was for elegance rather than display. The Duke entered with the air of a man accustomed to having rooms rearrange themselves around his will. He was not handsome in the manner young debutantes favoured. No soft jaw, no easy grin. His attractiveness belonged to something stricter: the confident line of his brow, the controlled set of his mouth, and the way his eyes seemed to weigh not only the speaker, but also the consequences of the words. When his gaze found Beatrice, it did not linger as if admiration were a pastime. It landed with the precision of a judge reading a document. Then it shifted away, as though he had already decided not to claim more than was offered. Beatrice had noticed too that he did not drink in excess. He moved with economy. He asked questions that were almost polite, almost while making it clear that he held more knowledge than he shared. He seemed to carry responsibility like a cloak. Society called him formidable. The servants called him feared. Mrs. Trench called him advantageous. "Do not look so startled," she told Beatrice that week, while smoothing a calloused fold along Beatrice's glove. "A duke is not a storm to be avoided. He is a weather vane. He shows where the world is turning." Beatrice only lifted her chin. "And if the world turns toward discomfort, Mrs. And if—" Trench's lips tightened. "Then we learn to stand where the air is kinder." She said it as if it were philosophy. It was matchmaking dressed in gloves. Ein Devir. On the evening after a particularly successful round of morning calls, successful for the sole reason that Beatrice had received them instead of being denied them, Mrs. Day. Trench announced that they would be invited to Wycliffe's country house for a small gathering. Beatrice learned, with a quickness that startled even herself, that the invitation carried a second message. It was not only that the Duke wished for company, it was that he wished for witnesses. The rival estate, an older house, set among formal gardens and stubborn hedgerows, belonged to an adjoining family with a bitter history of land disputes. Beatrice did not recall the name of every gentleman who had claimed to stand between her and scandal, but she recalled clearly that the rival family's drawing room contained more sharpened smiles than honest conversations. So when the day came that Mrs. Trench insisted Beatrice accompany them into the garden for a proper constitutional, before the evening began, Beatrice agreed. She agreed because her compliance was her cloak. She agreed because she knew that, in a season, the only safe way to move was to appear as though one were simply following tradition. The gardens were at their most flattering in late afternoon, roses climbing like gossip, their petals too lush to be believed. The rival family's walls held in warmth that the sky would soon withdraw. It was there, among terraces where the sound of conversation from the house faded and the birdsong became a private witness, that Beatrice found the Duke. She had expected to be approached by a gentleman. Instead, she saw him first as a silhouette beyond the hedge, emerging as though he had stepped out of a plan he could not forget. Duke Reginald Wycliffe did not call to her. He did not bow as if declaring himself. He simply walked with purpose toward a stone bench, shaded by an arch of climbing roses. Beatrice could have turned away. She could have returned to the house and allowed the ton to applaud her prudence. She did not. Instead, she moved with the calm of a woman who had already decided what she would tolerate. She sat at a measured distance from the Duke, her posture correct, but her hands not perfectly still. "My lady," he said, and in his voice there was no pleading. It was worse than pleading. It was certainty. Beatrice's heart did not race. It tightened. "Your Grace?" Her title came out as neat as lace. He looked at the roses rather than at her. "You are too disciplined for this sort of garden." "The garden has no opinion," Beatrice replied. "It does," he said softly. "It insists on being noticed." There was a pause, and Beatrice realized with a jolt that he was waiting for her to provide a response. She had spent years learning how to let silence behave in her favor. She would not waste the advantage she possessed. She chose restraint like a weapon. Then perhaps it should be taught manners. The Duke's mouth shifted, almost a smile. "Almost. You will not permit even a hedge to lead you into foolishness." "I have endured foolishness enough," Beatrice said, and her agency returned to her like breath. His eyes finally lifted to meet hers. For the first time, she saw the flaw in his control. Not weakness, but strain, an awareness of what could go wrong, written into the set of his shoulders. His authority, once it had been relied upon to solve problems, now appeared to create new ones. "I am told you refused a second offer," he said. Beatrice did not ask who told him. In society, information travelled faster than invitations. "I am also told," he continued, "that you do not speak of the reasons." Beatrice's gaze remained steady. "Reasons are private." "And yet," he said, "you have agreed to stand near a rival estate with the whole of the ton at your back." Her breath paused. It was not the question that troubled her. It was the implication that he understood her decisions too well. Beatrice's restraint did not soften. "Your Grace, if society wishes to invent a story, it will do so regardless of my position. And if I wish to prevent one," Beatrice blinked once. His request was not a confession, but it carried the weight of someone who had already decided he would accept the consequences. There was a genuine flaw in that, his willingness to risk what mattered, because he believed he could manage it after. "I do not command your motives," she replied. "No," he said, "but I intend to speak to them." She could have risen, smoothed her gown, returned to the house, and allowed Mrs. Trench to interpret everything later. Yet the Duke's gaze unsettled her, because it did not flatter. It did not treat her as a prize. It treated her as a problem worth solving with patience. And patience, she realized, was not what she had feared. She had feared passion. She had feared the kind of desire that made women forget their own hands. That evening, the scandal began not with an indiscretion, but with an observation. Mrs. Trench found Beatrice near the window of their sitting room while she waited for her dinner to be served. Trench's face had been powdered into composure. Her eyes betrayed her. "It is being said," Mrs. Trench began. Beatrice's heart remained quiet. It was her mind that sharpened. "What is being said?" "That you were seen, Mrs. Trench said, "in the gardens." Beatrice's chin lifted. "Many ladies walk." Mrs. Trench's smile was thin. "Yes, but few ladies are seen seated at the exact angle of a man's shadow." Beatrice did not allow surprise to reach her features. "Who sees us?" Mrs. Trench's eyes flickered toward the door. "Someone from the rival household. Someone who has made it their business to watch, who has the misfortune to look as though they are living." Beatrice understood then that this was not merely gossip. It was a contest, two estates with old grudges, using society as a weapon. In the following days, Beatrice endured the season's machinery. Calling cards arrived, with handwriting deliberately casual. Letters appeared addressed in flattering terms and ended in vague demands for an explanation. Women she had never spoken with spoke to her as if she were their cousin. Every morning call carried a different shade of curiosity. Some asked if her morning was truly complete. Some asked if she enjoyed the garden at the rival estate. Some asked, too delicately, whether she had found the Duke's attention agreeable. Beatrice's response was always silence. When asked directly by a lady with pearl earrings and sharp kindness, she curtsied and said nothing more. When pressed by a man who believed titles could substitute for manners, she thanked him for his concern and declined to enlarge upon it. Her agency grew stronger as her words reduced. The Duke did not appear in public with her, Crade. That too fueled the imagination of the ton. They could not decide whether he was protective or cowardly. They could not decide whether Beatrice was a conquest or a warning. At Elmax, Beatrice entered with a composure that took years to build. The doors opened to the murmuring press of ladies and gentlemen. Cards were exchanged, flowers were pinned to lapels. A chaperone moved as if she were guarding a cathedral. Mrs. Trench hovered near Beatrice, as though her proximity could prevent rumour from gaining traction. Beatrice's dress was a restrained white mourning, adjacent, without declaring itself so. The fabric caught candlelight softly, and the only vivid colour was in a ribbon at her neckline chosen deliberately because it matched the rose embroidery on the gloves she wore. It was a message to no one in particular. Her restraint did not go unnoticed by Duke Reginald Wycliffe. When he approached near the assembled musicians, he did not step too close. He waited for the moment that allowed propriety to cover his boldness. When he spoke, his voice carried only for Beatrice. "You are being punished for your silence," he said. Beatrice looked at him without flinching. "Silence is all I control." "And yet," he replied, "you have not refused me." Beatrice's pulse shifted. She did not remember agreeing to anything. She recalled only the way he had spoken in the garden. Certainty, patient risk, but the Duke's tone implied that he had taken her restraint as a consent. "I did not consent," she said. His gaze held hers. "Then you have not protected yourself either." The flaw in him surfaced then, his habit of believing that he could rearrange the consequences with his will. He saw a problem and treated it as an enemy to be subdued. Beatrice refused the temptation to correct him. She knew that speaking would invite him to argue, and she did not wish to be pulled into a debate the ton could watch, so she only curtsied. Society interpreted that curtsy as either affection or insult. Whispers began at once. They travelled through the assembly rooms like perfume poured on a hot day. The Duke is courting, the widow is playing, she is too sensible for him. No widow is too sensible for a duke. Mrs. Trench, who could smell trouble the way other women smelled flowers, tugged Beatrice back from a group of young ladies and steered her towards safety. "You must return calls," she hissed without truly raising her voice. "You must explain." Beatrice's eyes flashed with intelligence. "To whom, Mrs. Marr?" Trench's lips tightened. "To the ones who will otherwise ruin you." Beatrice shook her head. "I will not beg for mercy from those who enjoy cruelty." Mrs. Trench looked as though she might argue. Instead, she turned away, because even she understood that Beatrice would not be steered by fear. Behind the scenes, however, Beatrice's life was being handled by a hand that was not hers. A letter arrived at her lodging under cover of a calling card. It was delivered by a messenger whose respectful bow implied that he believed himself honourable while he carried something dangerous. The letter was from a solicitor connected to the Duke's household. Beatrice read it once, then again. The message was polite. It was also an indictment. Her husband's papers. Beatrice had thought safely locked away, had been requested. Her dower rights were being reviewed with an urgency that felt too sharp to be legal. The letter suggested that the Duke had commissioned the inquiry. And, in the margin, where etiquette usually limited itself to flourishes, someone had written a phrase in a tight hand: "You cannot be made to disappear by rumour." Beatrice set the paper down. Her mind ran through possibilities with the speed of someone who had survived grief by understanding facts. The Duke's risk was not only emotional, it was legal. He was interfering in her past. When she met him again, this time in a corridor, leading toward the gardens after a small dinner at the rival estate, she did not greet him as though she were pleased. "You have made inquiries," she said. He turned to face her. His expression, guarded as a locked drawer, carried the strain of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I have prevented a theft," he replied. Beatrice's voice stayed controlled. "From whom?" He did not answer immediately. That silence was a confession. Then he said, "From those who believe your widowhood makes you manageable." Beatrice's restraint did not soften. "My widowhood makes me mine." The Duke's eyes narrowed, not in anger, in recognition. "You know something," he said. Beatrice did. She knew that the rival family had entailed interests and that land disputes were never only about land. She knew that her name, once attached to property, could be used as leverage against men with debts. She knew that Mrs. Paula Trench's insistence on the season was not solely for Beatrice's happiness, it was also for her visibility. Visibility as currency. She could imagine how easily a widow could be squeezed between the world's appetites and a solicitor's eager pen. "What is the flaw in your judgment?" she asked, and there was a subtle edge to her question. It was not an accusation, it was curiosity. She wanted to understand the man before she allowed herself to want him. The Duke's jaw flexed. "I assume I can control the aftermath." Beatrice exhaled quietly. "You cannot." He looked away for a heartbeat, and in that movement, Beatrice saw the genuine flaw behind his authority. He was brave, yes, and he was capable, but he believed that courage was a substitute for caution. He returned his gaze to her. "And you assume you can survive without help?" Her breath caught. "I have survived." "Yes," he said. "Surviving is not the same as living." Beatrice's eyes stung, not with tears, but with a dangerous clarity of what his words invited her to consider. She had not allowed herself to live. She had arranged her days like a guard at a gate. Their conversation ended without further declarations. It had to. In Regency society, even the smallest moment of unchaperoned intimacy could become a scandal that ruined reputations and marriages in the same stroke. But the Duke did something different. He began to appear in public at the edges of Beatrice's world, never too close, never too obvious, yet always present where his presence could protect. When a gentleman attempted to corner her during a promenade, the Duke's attention shifted like a shield. When a lady spread a story that Beatrice had been careless in mourning, The Duke's calm rebuttal, delivered to the right person at the right time, turned rumour into uncertainty. It did not stop the whispers. It changed their direction. Instead of asking what Beatrice wanted, society began to wonder what the Duke was hiding. That was the new danger. On the night of a smaller season, ball less famous than Almack's, but more vicious in its gossip, Beatrice received another letter. This one was not from a solicitor, it was from Mrs. Selina Trench. Beatrice read it in the privacy of her chamber, while her maid pretended to adjust ribbons by the mirror. Mrs. Trench's handwriting had always been elegant. This time it was hurried. Mrs. Trench wrote that Beatrice must stop playing at dignity. The widow's reputation could be tarnished in an instant. Mrs. Trench warned that the Duke would not protect Beatrice if it cost him too much. And then she added a sentence that chilled Beatrice more effectively than any accusation. "Your late husband's papers will be of use to me." Beatrice read that line twice. Then she folded the letter as neatly as if it were harmless, and she did not scream or weep or call for explanations. She waited. The ball came. Beatrice arrived with her expression as steady as her spine. Mrs. Metcher Trench, beside her, wore the air of a woman who had rehearsed her concerns so that they would sound genuine. At supper, the rival family's matron sat with a grin. She watched Beatrice's every movement. Beatrice ate only what was required. She did not drink too much. She did not laugh at jokes. She did not enjoy. She let the room feel her distance. And then, when the Duke entered, when society's heads turned as though a string had tugged them, Beatrice made a decision. She rose before anyone could offer her a seat. Not in anger. In calculation, she approached the Duke with measured steps. Chaperones shifted, alert to a moment that could become a headline. Beatrice could feel their eyes like pins. When she reached him, she did not smile, she did not demand promises. She simply held out her gloved hand, palm up, as if receiving something. The Duke's gaze sharpened. "What is this?" he murmured. Beatrice's voice was calm. "The scandal has taken its first piece." She did not speak Mrs. Trench's name. Instead, she said, "Return my papers." For a breathless second, the Duke's composure wavered. Not because he lacked power, but because the request was too precise, too clear, about what he had done and what someone else had intended. He took her hand. His grip was not possessive. It was steady. He guided her away from the supper tables with subtlety rather than force. In a small antechamber near the garden doors, where candlelight softened faces and servants moved quietly, Beatrice closed the distance between them. "You wrote the note," she said. He did not deny it. "I did. And you asked about my husband's papers," she continued. "Yes," he said again. Beatrice tilted her head. "Then you know why my widowhood was treated as a lever." The Duke's eyes darkened. "I suspect." She waited. Her restraint meant the next sentence would be his. He exhaled as though the air were heavy. "The rival family's solicitor attempted to secure a claim on your dower. The claim would have been routed through my household's business." Beatrice's mind clicked pieces into place. "So your inquiries were both sword and smoke." His mouth tightened. "I acted, but I also withheld the full details because I believed I could resolve it before it reached you." There. His flaw again. He thought secrecy was protection. Beatrice looked at him, and her yearning rose like a tide that wanted permission. "You chose control over candor," she said. "I had to," he replied. "You are the kind of woman who would refuse a rescue that looked like pity." Beatrice's eyes widened slightly. She had not expected him to see her so clearly. She had always believed she hid her fear behind politeness. Yet he had noticed the pattern. Her restraint did not break into tears. It did something braver. It softened into truth. "I did not refuse because I despised help," she said. "I refused because I feared becoming indebted to a man's will." The Duke's thumb brushed her knuckles, so lightly it could be mistaken for accidental gentleness. Beatrice did not pull away. "And now?" he asked. Beatrice met his gaze. Now I must decide whether your will is the sort that honors mine." His eyes held hers as if he were searching for the hidden clauses in a contract. "I have faults," he said. "I would rather maneuver than surrender. I can be proud. I can be impatient." Beatrice's expression remained calm, but inside her, the yearning sharpened into desire with purpose. "I can do without pride," she replied. "I will not do without honesty." The Duke nodded once. "Then I will give it." He took a small leather folder from within his coat and offered it, not as a token, not as a bribe, but as evidence. Beatrice accepted it with poised fingers. Inside were copies of the inquiries he had ordered and the notices that had been prepared to seize what should have remained hers. The documents were sealed with stamps that indicated a timeline. A timeline meant planning. Beatrice's gaze lifted. "Mrs. Trench." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "Your lady companion." Beatrice did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "She wrote to me." He stared as though he had not believed that a trusted woman could be so careless with trust. "I warned her," he said. "I did not think she would risk it." Beatrice's anger flickered, but she did not indulge it. Her restraint remained her power, because she used it to force justice rather than explode into drama. "You must be careful," she said. "Not all enemies wear uniforms. Some wear mourning ribbons and call it devotion." The Duke's lips pressed together. "You would have handled it alone." Beatrice shook her head. "I would have endured it." "There is a difference." They returned to the ball with a plan forming between them. Silent, swift, and deliberate. The Duke would protect Beatrice in public without claiming her privately, until the scandal burned itself down on evidence rather than rumor. Then, under the cover of an early morning call the next week, they would confront Mrs. Barbara Trench with documents that would not permit denials. At dawn, Beatrice stood by the window at their lodging, while Mrs. Trench arranged her sleeves with exaggerated calm. When the calling card men arrived, 2 solicitors brought by the Duke, Mrs. Trench's face altered. It was subtle, but Beatrice had learned to read faces the way other women read novels. The solicitors entered and laid papers on the table. The Duke arrived last, wearing the polite mask of a man who understood propriety, even while he threatened to undo it. "Mrs. Beer." Trench attempted a smile. "Your Grace," she said sweetly. "I was merely attempting to guide my dear friend." Beatrice did not permit the word dear. "You intended to use my husband's papers," Mrs. Mess said. Trench's eyes darted toward the Duke, looking for rescue in his authority. "You will regret accusing me," Mrs. Trench said. Beatrice's answer was quiet. "I do not accuse without proof." The Duke stepped forward. "The rival solicitor will be notified that his claim is invalid." Mrs. Trench's smile faltered. "What claim?" "The one you helped draft," Beatrice said. Mrs. Trench's composure returned, but it was strained now. "It is not uncommon for widows to be advised." Beatrice's voice remained composed. "Advice that seeks to extract an estate is not counsel. It is theft, dressed as kindness." The solicitors spoke with dry certainty. Legal language did what anger could not. It ended the debate. Mrs. Trench left with her head high, but her eyes ruined by the knowledge that society would not forgive a woman who betrayed trust. She expected pity. Beatrice offered none. In the days that followed, the Tun shifted its attention. As it always did, gossip moved like weather. And once it found new storms, it forgot the old ones. Beatrice's reputation stabilized, not because she became more compliant, but because she became untouchable in the one way that mattered. She could not be made into a rumor without consequences. The Duke, too, faced questions. Men asked why he had interfered with the widow's affairs. Women wondered if Beatrice had bewitched him. Some suggested that the Duke sought a late marriage for convenience. Beatrice did not correct them. She let silence speak again. But her silence now was no longer only defense. It was also restraint, as power. When the Duke asked to call on her, it was not as a command. He arrived at her door on an afternoon suited for morning calls. Late enough that it felt like visiting rather than demanding, he waited in the drawing room until chaperones and servants had performed their duties. At last he was alone with Beatrice. "I could have forced a solution," he said. Beatrice lifted her gaze. "And you did not. I chose negotiation," he admitted, "because I have begun to fear the aftermath of my own decisions." Beatrice's heart tightened. Fear is a kind of honesty. The Duke's expression shifted, something like relief, something like shame. "I have been reckless in pursuit of control." Beatrice watched him carefully. "Then be reckless in a different manner." He frowned. "What manner?" Beatrice's agency returned with a quiet elegance. "Be reckless with me. Tell me the truth, even when it makes you less admirable." His eyes held hers. "Very well." He drew a breath. "I did not merely investigate because I could. I investigated because I could not bear the thought that the world would swallow you." Beatrice felt the yearning pull through her ribs like a ribbon tugged free. "And if I told you," she asked, "that I cannot marry a man who believes he must always act first?" The Duke's jaw flexed. "Then do not marry me." The flaw in him, his impatience, his assumption, was not fatal. It was workable. If he could admit fault and adjust, then perhaps his will could honor hers rather than dominate. She did not answer with words that could be repeated and twisted by the tongue. Instead, she curtsied, once, perfectly, and in that motion she granted him something precious, permission to hope. After supper that evening, Beatrice walked into the garden one last time. The roses were fading into the late hour. The rival estates' hedges stood still, as if refusing to carry rumour across the walls. At the stone bench, Duke Reginald Wycliffe waited. He offered her no speech about destiny. He offered her something better, a plan made with care. "My solicitor will draft a settlement," he said. "Not to claim you, not to bind you without your consent, only to ensure that no future court can reduce your rights to a convenient rumour." Her face serene. "And what of your own name?" she asked. "Can you risk it for mine?" He did not pretend it was easy. "My name has never been delicate," he said, "but yes, I can risk it." Beatrice's yearning steadied into conviction. "Then I will risk it too." He reached for her hand again, and this time, she allowed the touch to linger for the length of a decision. When society asked later, because society always asked, why Beatrice had returned to the world, and why the Duke's attention now seemed less like protection and more like partnership, Beatrice gave them nothing to chew upon. At the next season ball, she arrived in a gown not white, but softly rose-tinted, as though mourning had been transformed rather than erased. She danced with the Duke for a single set, because her restraint remained her signature. Not refusal, but control. When the dance ended, she did not remain for supper. She left before the gossip could invent another story. Yet when she stepped into the carriage, the Duke joined her without apology, and in that small act of propriety, the ton received the only truth Beatrice had ever been willing to share. The widow's oath was not broken by weakness. It was rewritten by choice. A month later, in a church that smelled of beeswax and spring rain, Beatrice stood with her veil in place and her spine unbent. She did not cry. She did not tremble. "You know," she looked at the Duke and recognized at last the difference between being rescued and being loved. The Duke's vows were not poetic. They were practical promises that addressed the risks she had learned to fear. And when she answered, her words were not loud, not dramatic, and not suited for gossip. They were suited for a life. Society could whisper afterward all it wished. Beatrice would still know what she knew, that intelligence and restraint could be romance's sharpest instrument, and that even a formidable Duke could learn to honor a woman's agency, rather than merely control the consequences. Neutral studio background, soft lighting, photorealistic,